Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly and I'm a mixed media artist who specializes in gouache paint, ink work, and sometimes I do digital painting. In this week's video, we'll be going over this fabric study that I did of the Grim Reaper using watercolor pencils and gouache paint. So let's get into it. The first thing you will notice upon looking at this Grim Reaper hood is that there's a lot of folds, a lot of fabric gathers, and that ultimately results in a lot of abstract, confusing shapes that can sometimes get muddied when we try to analyze and observe them, which makes drawing them and painting them a lot harder. So something that I like to do, especially with subject matter that is pretty detailed like this in a confusing way, is I like to start my underpainting with watercolor pencils. I do this because I find it's a lot easier for me to establish structure around the object I'm trying to create form with, and it also helps really distinguish each shape. And I find that because I've been drawing longer than I've been painting, it's a lot more approachable to start a painting like a drawing, right? So what I did here was I used a blue watercolor pencil for areas where it's generally going to be not just highlighted, but just showing the local color of the cloak. The cloak is a very cool toned gray, so it kind of has this blue cast to it. So I'm using that in areas that are not shaded. And then of course in areas that are shaded, I included a bunch of layers of black watercolor pencil. And what's great about this is that the more layers of the watercolor pencil that you apply, once you activate it with water, it will be more pigmented in those areas. So I just like starting my painting like this because it's way more approachable and has a lot of structure to it, to those weird organic shapes that are kind of clustered around each other. Next, I'm going to be blocking out the background as well as where the face would typically be with black. With gouache paint, you really have to have this exact consistency to it in order to get full opacity. You kind of want it to be the consistency of melted ice cream. In this case, I just opted for more of a translucent finish because I'm going to be adding a lot more layers on the cloak later, and it's going to be affecting the outside perimeter of the subject. And sometimes while I'm working, I'm kind of messy, and I don't want a perfectly finished background to end up having random splotches of water or lint stuck to it. So I'm just going to leave this kind of transparent looking until the very end, because I don't trust myself, okay? In areas that I indicated are going to be shaded in the underpainting, I'm doing a thin layer of black gouache paint and feathering out those blocked in areas to create more of a gradient, and I'm just building up those cast shadows within the wrinkles of the clothing. When I start a painting, I like doing the contrasting colors and values first, and then working my way towards the mid-tone to get the general form of the subject matter, and then in the details, that's when I do the highest point of highlights, the darkest darks, and very fine details. So right here, since I already blocked in the shadows, I'm using some white gouache paint that I mixed with some cobalt blue watercolor. You can use blue gouache paint as well, that's totally fine. I find that if I cut it with some watercolor though, it does give more of a looser gradient and makes the gouache better to blend. Although you do lose some of that opacity. I don't really care about that in this stage right now though. However, I'm just blocking in those highlights and blending them out, and then I'm working on more of the specific mid-tone shading. So right now I'm working on more of the midtones. What I did was I created a gray using my titanium white and ivory black mixture, and I did include the smallest amount of cobalt blue watercolor, again because the fabric in this study is very cool toned. The lighting is kind of like moonlight, very blue, so I wanted to add just a tiny bit of blue to the gray midtones. And right now I am merging together those two very high contrasting values I previously laid down with the white gouache paint and the black gouache paint. A lot of painting, I think I've said this in a previous video, a lot of painting is doing very repetitive things, going back and forth, but just getting more specific with it the more detailed you go. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. So earlier you saw me use black gouache paint to block out where the shadows are going to go, and I'm doing another layer of that right now basically. I further enhance the darkest darks within the folds of the clothing, and I'm also creating a similar color that I mixed up for the midtone using gray and a little bit of that watercolor cobalt blue. However, I'm adding a little bit more black to that mixture because there's going to be some of that gray. You know, it's a whole value scale. There isn't going to be just black and white. There's a bunch of different gradients of gray in between, and that's basically what I'm doing. I'm doing more of those midtones that are closer to where the shadows are in the value scale. I'm concentrating a lot more of the deeper values to the bottom portion of the figure, especially underneath where that kind of cowl neck situation is going on. There's a lot more shadows being cast there because the moonlight is directly above the figure. So you're going to see a lot more shadows going vertically down, especially underneath all those fabric folds that are right around the neck area. At this point, I'm doing a lot of blending before I get into a more detailed stage. So a lot of those paintbrush rough edges kind of going on around the cloak, I'm just getting a damp brush. So I just dip it in clean water and then I blot both sides off once on a paper towel, and then I use that damp brush to feather out the edges and the color blocks I have established. And that is how you get a really good, soft, diffused gradient with gouache paint. Next, I'm getting more specific with my shading and getting more detailed as I go. Right here, I'm kind of bouncing between ivory black in areas where the darkest darks need to gradually get darker, especially in areas that are right underneath a fabric fold. And I'm also in other areas mixing some more ivory black with that previous blue-gray mixture I had mixed up. And depending on the area, what I'm doing is first establishing where I need it to be super dark, and then using that blue-gray mixture, I'm using that to feather out that black to really create a good dark gradient across. And depending on the area is how much black versus gray I use. So this crease right here that is casting a really dark shadow onto the rest of the cloak, there's going to be more of a rich ivory black pigmentation going on there because that shadow is larger, it's further away from the light source, therefore it's going to be darker. And I'm getting more specific, doing the same thing, but I'm getting more specific with all of these folds and just really establishing, where is the shadow going to be the absolute darkest, and then where is it going to follow the contour of the fabric fold. And I'm using that blue-gray mixture I previously had set aside to feather out that ivory black around the contours of the fabric. As I go along, I'm making sure to get a brush and some clean water, blotting it off on both sides once onto a paper towel or a rag, and then I'm feathering out any of those edges to make sure all of the colors blend into each other seamlessly. At this stage, I'm approaching the super finer details because I have a lot of the form established in the subject matter. So after doing some extra blending, I decided to go in and commit to the black background and the black void in the face within the hood. So I just got my ivory black out, and like I said earlier, to get that fully opaque texture to your gouache paint, you just want to go for a melted ice cream consistency, and then I just applied that, and as you could see, it makes such a beautiful finish. I love the velvety texture to it. When doing the super fine details, I opt for as small of a brush as possible. I'm not using one here, but sometimes I actually use nail art brushes, and especially if you want to do individual frayed threads on some fabric, hair, things like that, I really recommend getting some nail art brushes because you can get ones that are longer bristled and have very few hairs on them, so they're very thin. Really good for pinstriping as well. The longer the bristles, the more control you have and less shaky your lines are going to look. Anyway, so that was this week's video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and if you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing, mayhaps. And I will see you next week. Bye!